Imagine this. You see the American flag flying, the bald eagle soaring majestically, arrows clutched in its talons, an image that feels timeless, powerful, and uniquely American. But what if I told you that these very symbols, the ones we have been taught to see as pure expressions of America's soul, were not born in 1776 or imagined by the founding fathers, but instead are fragments of indigenous cultures that had flourished for thousands of years before Europeans ever set foot on these shores? What if the most sacred emblems of America's national identity, the eagle, the arrows, the radiant sun, the totem pole, even the myths of rugged frontiers and manifest destiny, were in fact borrowed, adapted, and in many cases stolen from native nations? This paradox sits at the heart of our story. America, a nation desperate to appear ancient and rooted, built its identity on symbols that were already infused with centuries of indigenous meaning, even as the people who created them were pushed aside, silenced, and erased from the narrative. Tonight, we ask a haunting question. What does it mean for a country to claim ownership of symbols it did not create? And what is the cost of building national myths not on your own foundations, but on the sacred emblems of those you have conquered? Symbols are not mere decorations. They are containers of meaning, compact expressions of identity, power, and belonging. Every nation seeks them out. The lion of England, the dragon of China, the rising sun of Japan. These are not random choices, but carefully chosen emblems meant to connect people to a sense of shared destiny. For the United States, a young republic fresh from rebellion, the problem was acute. How does a new nation, barely a few years old, make itself look timeless? How does it create the illusion of ancient depth when in truth it was still in its infancy? The founding fathers were clever men, but they were also opportunists. They understood that to give the new nation gravitas, they would need symbols that felt powerful, rooted, and older than the country itself. Where could they find such symbols? They did not have to look far. For thousands of years, indigenous peoples had developed vast symbolic systems tied to the land, the sky, the animals, and the spiritual forces of the continent. These were not empty icons, but sacred emblems, carrying the weight of myth, ritual, and social order. The Thunderbird of the Great Lakes, the bound arrows of the Haudenosaunee, the radiant sun motifs of the Mississippian mound builders, all of these carried the aura of ancient authority. And so, while treaties were signed and broken, while native villages were displaced and communities pushed westward, the new republic quietly absorbed these indigenous symbols into its own fabric. The irony is staggering. At the very moment America was seeking to erase native sovereignty, it was borrowing native power to create the illusion of its own. The eagle that soared above the flag, the arrows held in the Great Seal, the imagery that filled the rhetoric of freedom and destiny, these were not American inventions, but appropriations. The young nation, lacking its own ancient heritage, built one from pieces it did not own. Consider the bald eagle, the most famous emblem of the United States. In 1782, Congress adopted the eagle as the national bird, presenting it as a symbol of freedom, independence, and courage. The story, as we are taught, is simple. The eagle was majestic, fierce, and native to the land, the perfect emblem for a new republic. But this tidy tale conceals a much deeper history. Long before Congress debated between the eagle and the turkey, native nations had already elevated the eagle to sacred status. Across the plains and Great Lakes, eagle feathers were considered marks of honor, bestowed on warriors for acts of bravery worn in ceremonies, and cherished as connections to the spirit world. These were not trophies, but living emblems of respect, honor, and courage. Beyond the eagle itself, in cultures stretching from the Great Lakes to the Pacific Northwest, there was the Thunderbird, a supernatural being of immense power, capable of summoning storms and casting lightning. The Thunderbird was no metaphor. It was a spiritual force, revered and feared, believed to be the bringer of rain, the controller of thunder, the guardian of balance. Its imagery appears on effigy mounds, carved into pipes, painted onto hides. For centuries, native peoples understood the eagle as both a creature of the earth and a messenger of the sky, a bridge between worlds. When the United States chose the eagle, it was tapping into this reservoir of indigenous meaning, though it never admitted as much. Instead, the official story focuses on Benjamin Franklin's joke about preferring the turkey. This shallow anecdote hides the deeper truth. The eagle was already sacred, already powerful, already charged with meaning by the native peoples of this continent. In choosing the eagle, America was not inventing a symbol, it was appropriating one. And in doing so, it stripped the eagle of its indigenous resonance, transforming it into a symbol of federal power while erasing the Thunderbird that lingered behind it. The eagle we salute on the flag is not simply a bird of freedom, it is a shadow of the Thunderbird, a sacred being whose power was borrowed, renamed, and nationalized. The Great Seal of the United States is one of the most important national emblems. It appears on money, on passports, on treaties. It is the official signature of the Republic. But look closely, and you will see something unexpected. Traces of indigenous imagery woven into its design. The eagle on the front clutches an olive branch in one talon and arrows in the other, while the reverse shows a radiant eye above a pyramid. Historians often explain these as products of European influence: the Roman fasces, the Enlightenment's all-seeing eye, the neoclassical fascination with pyramids. But one element stands out: the bundle of arrows. In Haudenosaunee tradition, the image of bound arrows was the central symbol of the Confederacy. 5 arrows, bound together, represented the unity of the 5 nations: Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca. Alone, a single arrow could be broken, but bound together, they were unbreakable. This imagery was central to the great law of peace, the political philosophy that bound the Haudenosaunee together in one of the most enduring democracies of the pre-Columbian world. When the Great Seal depicted arrows clutched in the talon of the eagle, it was echoing this indigenous emblem. But notice the transformation. In Haudenosaunee symbolism, the arrows meant unity and peace. In the American version, they meant war and power. The meaning was twisted, repurposed for a different narrative. Now consider the radiant sun imagery. In Mississippian cultures, particularly at Cahokia, the falcon and the sun were central emblems of authority. Radiant beings appear in copper plates, shell gorgets, and mound art, representing cycles of cosmic power, life, death, and renewal. When the Great Seal placed an all-seeing eye within a radiant sun above a pyramid, it fused European mysticism with imagery that had already existed in North America for centuries. In this way, the Great Seal was not a purely European invention. It was a collage, blending Enlightenment symbols with indigenous motifs to create an emblem that looked timeless, mysterious, and deeply rooted in the land. Yet once again, the indigenous origins were erased. The arrows were no longer Iroquois. The radiant sun was no longer Cahokian. They had been absorbed into the American fabric, leaving only faint echoes of their true sources. As the 19th century wore on, America faced another challenge: how to create a cultural identity that felt rich, deep, and distinctly its own. Europe had castles, cathedrals, and millennia of art. America, by contrast, had barely a century of history. The solution was the same as before: borrow from the peoples already here. Totem poles, once dismissed by missionaries as pagan idols, suddenly became celebrated as distinctly American artifacts. They were transported to world's fairs, exhibited in museums, and even erected in parks as tourist attractions. Stripped of their tribal context, they were presented not as living sacred narratives, but as generic emblems of wilderness, reduced to decorations that symbolized America's native roots, while ignoring the voices of the native carvers themselves. The Boy Scouts, founded in the early 20th century, borrowed heavily from imagined versions of native traditions. Children were taught to wear headdresses, paint their faces, and conduct tribal councils. Rituals that were supposed to connect them to the wilderness, but were in fact caricatures of real indigenous practices. In frontier myths, too, we see the same pattern. The West was presented as a stage of rugged independence, but the imagery leaned heavily on native cosmologies: suns setting as metaphors for vanishing Indians, animals turned into settler trophies, sacred circles of storytelling reduced to campfire entertainment. America was not inventing its own culture. It was piecing together fragments of indigenous traditions and repackaging them as its own. Yet the contradiction was glaring. The same nation that put totem poles in its fairs was forcing native children into boarding schools where their languages, ceremonies, and art were outlawed. America wanted the image of native culture, but not the reality of native survival. It wanted the symbols without the people, the stories without the storytellers. By the 20th century, the appropriation of native symbols had become mass-produced. Sports teams named themselves after native warriors and tribes: the Redskins, the Braves, the Chiefs, the Indians. These mascots were not tributes, but caricatures, reducing complex cultures to cartoon faces, feathers, and war cries. Corporations branded themselves with dream catchers, tomahawks, arrows, and teepees, using sacred symbols as marketing gimmicks. Even the military borrowed native names to project ferocity: Apache helicopters, Black Hawk helicopters, Tomahawk missiles. Imagine the irony. A country that once outlawed native ceremonies now names its weapons after the very peoples it suppressed. Cars and consumer goods joined the trend: Thunderbirds rolling down highways, Jeep Cherokees on suburban streets, Pontiac Arrows sold in dealerships. Each of these symbols carried an ancient indigenous meaning, but in American hands, they became products stripped of context. The Thunderbird was no longer a storm spirit commanding thunder. It was a shiny vehicle. The arrow was no longer a sacred emblem of unity. It was a design for speed and sharpness. In this way, the appropriation reached its final stage: commercialization. Sacred emblems were hollowed out and sold, their original power erased in favor of consumer appeal. Yet paradoxically, their very survival in popular culture proves their enduring strength. The symbols could not be erased. They were too powerful. They survived, but in distorted forms, shadows of themselves echoing in logos, mascots, and brand names. And while most Americans never saw the origins, the symbols remained alive, stubbornly clinging to the nation's imagination. Proof that indigenous power could never be fully silenced, even when it was stolen. So, what is the cost of stolen symbols? On one hand, these images give America the illusion of depth, a sense of heritage. a connection to the land it claims as its own. On the other hand, they hide a darker truth. America's national identity is built not only on native land, but on native symbols, appropriated and rebranded as its own. This is not a harmless borrowing. It is a form of cultural erasure, one that strips sacred emblems from their original context and silences the people who gave them meaning. The eagle is not just a bird of freedom, it is the Thunderbird, borrowed and renamed. The arrows are not just military emblems, they are the echo of Haudenosaunee unity, twisted into a symbol of federal war power. The totem poles in museums are not just American art, they are living stories, uprooted and displayed as lifeless decorations. And yet, despite all attempts at erasure, these symbols endure. Native peoples continue to tell their stories, to carry their traditions, to reclaim what was taken. And as we uncover the hidden layers of America's imagery, we are faced with a choice. Do we continue to celebrate these symbols as empty icons of patriotism, or do we acknowledge the deeper history they conceal? America's symbols are haunted, layered, contested, and alive with the voices of those who first created them. The untold secret of American identity is this: it is not original, it is borrowed, and the story of those borrowings is a story of survival, resilience, and resistance. What did you think about today's video? Comment your thoughts and suggestions for my next video below. I'd love to hear what you'd like to uncover next in the untold history of America.